end up editing it and taking things out. There's too much noise or whatever. So let's get started.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to welcome to Boston Praise Radio and TV and Boston Black News a good friend that I really haven't heard from. He hasn't heard from me. I haven't heard from him in a long time. But we knew that each other still existed, that we were still alive in our respective worlds. And so, Alan Swartz, welcome to our radio and TV ministry. Great to have you with us. And
It's
today we want to spend some time talking about Drop a Dime and how we connected with it and how we connected with each other. And then I wanted to talk about the Camden and Lenox Street occupation, which was really our first one when we went there to take it over. So talk to the listeners about how you got pulled into Drop a Dime Report Crime, and then to also tell the listeners what is Drop a Dime Report Crime. What is it?
all right. All right. I somewhere around 81, 82, uh, uh, was doing well enough in my business that I could either make money or time, and I decided to make time. And I wandered from one effort to another, and one day got the idea of walking into the Roxbury Multi-Service Center and saying, I'd like to volunteer.
Okay.
And they said, well, tell you what, we've got a fella here named Eduardo Maynard,
Yeah.
who's about to, start doing something. Why don't you team up with him? Eduardo Maynard was my first mentor. I asked Eduardo, oh, what are we going to do? And Eduardo made the key first lesson in that moment. He said, I don't know.
Mm.
Let's go out in the street and talk to people and find out what
Right.
to do.
Right.
We spent maybe a year doing that. And at the end of the year, we had met a few people, more than a few. And Georgette Watson was one of them. At a meeting, she said, I'm going to walk with you. And she had more experience than Eduardo and had been trying to make some differences in the neighborhood and was a great asset. So she introduced us to more people, and the three of us started going to meetings at night during the day, talking to businesses. And at the end of that, which was now we're in a year and a half or so, we had brought into the circle my wife at the time, Sandy, and a couple of fellas from Dorchester whose names I can't recall. And we sat down together and said, gee, we can see what the problem is. Maybe let's talk this out and figure out what the solution might be. The problem was that there were dealers working the streets, corner boys. And the neighbors would look out their windows and see what was going on. And they were afraid.
Yeah.
We found out and they said to us, we're afraid. Why are you afraid? We're afraid because we think these folks on the street may harm us. For all we know, a bullet through the window.
Yeah.
And when we asked them, well, why don't you go to the police about it? They said, we don't trust the police. For all we know, they'll mention our names to the kids, and then I'll really have a bullet through my window.
Let me stop you there. So I had a I had a lady come to me many years ago and say that they were having problems on the street with the drug dealers, and I was new to this myself, and I suggested to her that she go to the police. I said, "Why don't you go to the police and tell them what you see and what's going on?" And she came back to me a couple weeks later and told me she will never do that again. And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the drug dealers came to her and told her if she goes to the police again, they would kill her." And that was that was a wake up call for me. That was a reality maker. So go ahead. You said the same thing.
We've discovered the same thing. And I remember that night, Georgette goes like this and she says, you know, a year or so ago, I tried a tip line
Okay.
to collect tips, and it didn't work.
Hmm.
But it's pretty obvious to me that if we could do it right, we'd have something.
Hmm.
And Eduardo and Georgette and Sandy and I and the fellows from Dorchester all said, well, let's do what we've been doing with a little extra twist. Let's go back out in the street and go to all the meetings and talk to people and get more and more acquainted and say to them, if we did a tip line, what would make it work for you?
Hmm.
What would make it work for you? What do you, you know, I don't know how many more months that was, but the neighborhood made it clear. And the message was kind of like this. Okay, I tell you what, we know who you all are.
Okay.
We know where to find you. We want you to carry any tips we give you to the police. And you are not going to reveal
Right.
who we are. You're going to stand between them and us.
Okay. Okay. So in 1983, I was working in Roxbury. I was working at the juvenile court as a clerk magistrate, but my street work advocacy was in Roxbury. And one day, one of the young people in my youth group walked one block or to the end of the block of where the church was, went into a store to make a purchase, and came out and told me that she had to stand in line while the owner transacted a drug transaction while she stood in line waiting to buy her products. And she said, "This doesn't make any sense. You're in the pulpit talking about faith and hope, and right down the street, there's a right next to the church, they're selling drugs. You know, so can your faith come from the pulpit and go into the street?" And so in
Ooh,
1983, I organized a march against crime, and somehow Georgette and I connected because there was either a white person or a black person who was murdered in the Dorchester area, and Georgette was having an
mm,
event at a church, and she invited me, and I came and walked the streets with her, and so when I did the march against crime, I asked her if she would join me, and she did, and we marched from Dudley Station all the way to Grove Hall to the Nation of Islam. And it was on that day that a black pastor stood up and said, we have to stop this conspiracy of silence. We got to tell what's going on in our community. That was Reverend
Oh,
Charles Stitz said that. And that, so
yes.
I'm assuming that this whole tip line had been percolating before we had the march, because I don't know how she and I talked about it, but we talked about it. And the next thing I knew, a tip line was being set up. And with all of us around, I had goodwill with the people in Roxbury. Georgette had goodwill with the people where she lived, and people trusted us before the tip line. And I think that helped to garner the support that we needed for the tip line.
Exactly. Exactly. And a little aside about this, Georgette sets up this tip line,
Okay.
and we're saying, okay, how's it going? Georgette said they get they get really upset with someone answering the phone. They don't want me to answer the phone.
Yeah.
They want me to just put an answering machine on the phone,
Right.
and so they can talk and hang up. She
Right.
said it's crazy, but that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And the tips began to flow.
Yeah.
And Georgette would transcribe the tips.
Yeah.
She'd walk down to where was the station? Ruggles?
There was the Area B police station in Roxbury.
Yeah, Area C. Yeah. And walk in and see the chief. And basically he ignored her.
Mhm.
Now, she was familiar with some of the officers,
Right.
and she said, this doesn't make sense. You ought to see this stuff. And the officer said, you typed these tips out, didn't you? And she said, yeah. They said, put it on the bulletin board.
Oh no. For what?
Well, instead of going to the police chief, she just pinned it to the bulletin board.
Okay.
And what started happening was the sheet began to disappear.
Uh-oh.
And the as you recall, and I don't like the method, but promotions were based on arrests.
Okay.
Once a officer pulled the sheet off the bulletin board, the officer would follow the lead and started making arrests,
I see.
and arrests led to promotions,
I see.
and the whole thing started to open up. And that to me was the beginning of Drop a Dime and the neighborhood starting to make a place for themselves in this drama.
Yeah, but you were a volunteer, so
Mm.
what prompted you to go even deeper? And because all of us involved, Nate Skia, Robert Woodson, all of us who were involved, we were putting our lives on the line because we were very visible around this thing. So how did you reconcile that in your mind that this could be dangerous?
Uh, I had a wonderful partner in Sandy.
Hmm.
Uh, I had a wonderful mentor in you, because one night the two Dorchester people said, Jesus, we're making arrests, and people are going to jail, and the next thing we know, they're back out, and they just moved to another corner. We're
Yeah.
not making a difference.
Yeah.
and they left. And you said to us, when you're confronted with something that has problems, such as risk, physical risk to you, uh, and you see your efforts uh, having effects such as these fellas just talked about, what do you do?
Yeah.
And we just looked at you. And you said, I think what we do is we reach into our souls and ask ourselves and God, am I doing the right thing?
Mm-hmm.
And once God answers you, if God says this is the right thing to do, then risk becomes, frankly, this is going to sound crazy, Bruce, but sounds immaterial. And there is no such thing as failure.
Mm-hmm.
There's only an event that occurs that isn't what you expected it to be, and you use that as a lesson to do it better.
Mm-hmm.
I will never forget that evening with you.
Mm. Well, I know that the number of calls that were coming in at the beginning was around 6 calls. That's all been documented. By the time the program reached its maturity and ended, it was well over 600 calls a month. There was 6 calls a month. Then it went up to over 600 calls a month that were coming in, and they not only were being given to the Boston police, but it was given to the state police. It was given to the federal authorities. Georgette had developed a relationship with all of these law enforcement officials, and then it was either Mayor Flynn or one of the police commissioners who came to Georgette and I and asked what police officer we trusted, who did we think we could work with, and we said Joe Carter. And
Yes.
right, so Joe Carter was appointed from whatever rank he had to a superintendent, and he was supposed to work with us, but also protected us whenever we went rogue and started in these apartments and these houses to keep the drug dealers from getting their stash, and to mobilize the community and said to the community, we're going to be gone in a week, so we've got 5 days to work together, but when we go, we're going to make sure you have the same contacts that we have, right? And taught them how to fight back without us, because we had to teach them how to fight. We couldn't do this for them forever.
Right. Right. Absolutely. It started to work. I remember she had monthly meetings with city police, state police, FBI, and DEA in a closed room.
Yeah.
The what we learned was that the tips were over 90% accurate, voluminous, and enabled authorities to break some drug cartels up 3 levels. Now, once you get up to the third level, you've about taken it all out. It's still not easy, and there's a lot more to be done, which I've learned needs to be done. But Georgette was the centerpiece of it, and you were the master of street theater. You knew how to bring attention to a problem by going to the physical location where the problem was and doing something about it. And I was just, I have this photograph from the Globe back in, what was it, 86, when we occupied the crack house on Oakwood.
Oakwood Street, yeah.
And there were standing Sandy and me and Georgette and Bruce and a couple of other folks, I believe, holding a great big long sign that we were in front of the crack house saying we're going to move in. And you are the one who masterminded those events. So it was the two of you, and we were along for the ride. What was, I think, helped was that, which, angers me a lot as well, because of the way our society views each other. The fact that we were white and along for the ride got a little extra boost,
It was
and I was happy to
but it was also,
be a part of it because of that.
it was also protection. Is that they couldn't have allowed anything to happen to the white members of the team at all. They had
Right.
to, that would have been horrific. And Joe Carter
Right.
was very serious. But when we went to Oakwood Street, I remember one night Georgette and I were the only two in that place. I had a sleeping bag in one room. She had a sleeping bag in another room, and there was a police detail outside protecting us. And Joe Carter came by to check to see how things were going. He kicked the door in. I said, "Why are you so angry?" And he said, the detail that was supposed to protect you, somebody called them off, and you have no protection out here. And and he was angry. He wanted to get to the bottom of who called off the detail. So I mean, that kind of stuff happened too. But having Joe Carter with us, Joe was somebody that I respected. Joe was somebody that I trusted God, but I also trusted him. I could say anything to him. I could share anything with him, and he would find a way to protect all of us. And so again, God had provided for us. We were the right people for the right time in the right city, because the occupation, sleeping in these houses, these drug houses, came from a mayor, an elected official did it in some other city, some other state, and they wanted to feel what their constituencies was feeling, right? And so they went and they lived among them. And that's why I got the idea that if we did the same thing. And when we went to Camden,
Beautiful.
when we moved in, I've always told the story that the young people in the streets, on the night that we moved in, they were shouting, "You're gonna die, you're gonna die." That was their theme song, that we're gonna die. And I said to myself, wow, the heroes are the drug dealers. The punks are people like us who are not involved in that life, and those kids see them as the heroes. And so when we made it the whole week and then came out of there, two things happened when we came out. One, the kids had changed their minds, and they respected us for staying the whole week, because we didn't just stay in the apartment. We walked around at night. We were checking different places, right? Talking to people.
Yeah.
And I said this on the other video with Craig, that a guy came to me and said, "Thank you for coming down." And I said, "This is our privilege to come down." And he said, "No, you don't understand. My wife was afraid that one of these dealers were going to violate her, attack her and violate her, because we lived among them. And she was contemplating suicide." And so he said, for the week that you came down, it was so quiet down there that she had an opportunity to finally come to me as her husband, he said, and tell me that she was afraid and that she was going to commit suicide. And so our presence in that place gave her the strength to go to her husband, and her life was really saved. And I've shared that story. Oh, that's called unintended consequences. You go down to do one thing, but other things are happening all around what you're doing that are positive and are changing people's lives. Gave those kids another set of heroes, to look at, and because we were brave enough to come into their world and live in their world for a week. So there was
Yep.
so many different things that happened because of what we thought we were
Yep.
going in for this reason, but God had it that many other things happened too as a result of us being.
Yes,
So
exactly. That's why you go there. You
right.
don't go there because you have this great idea that it's going to work a certain way. You go there to be there, and it begins to take on a life of its own under the hand of someone other than you. And you become an instrument of that will.
Did
You
you
are not the doer.
did you ever hear the story of what Hollywood was going to do with Drop a Dime? Did Georgette ever tell you that story? Well,
No.
Georgette and I, Hollywood had heard about what was going on, and they wanted to make a movie about what Georgette and I were doing. And so some screenwriters came to Boston, came to her house. They wanted to write us checks for $1,000 apiece as a retainer, and they were going to write the script. And so in the contract, they were going to have a romantic scene between Georgette and I. Number one, two, there were going to be swears and all that kind of stuff because it has to be true to life. So I took my contract and I said there will be no sexual scenes, love scenes with Georgette and I. Number one, she's married. Number two, I know her husband. And number three, nothing like that ever happened. So right? Can you imagine me as a pastor letting them do something like that? And so Georgette, though, on the other hand, Georgette didn't care. Georgette didn't care. And then I said, there will be no swears, no profane words in this movie. And with that, they went back to Hollywood and said they weren't going to do it. They needed the love romantic thing, and they needed a realistic
Yeah.
piece. But again,
Yeah.
I wasn't going to sell my soul
Mm.
and have the people in my church wonder if I lost it, if I
Right.
didn't do that. But so when all this
Exactly.
started happening, the sleeping in the houses and all these things, did you ever once think that you were in over your head? Number one, and number two, what was that first experience at Camden and Lennox? How did you get the courage to walk in there with Georgette and myself and Bobby Woodson? Because that was you and Sandy walked in together. You came down.
Yeah.
So how did you work that in your head?
Um, again, uh, Sandy was every bit as uh, calm, and uh, she simply, her attitude was uh, what she said to me one day when I told her what was starting to go on with Drop a Dime. She simply said to me, "I want to join you."
Wow.
Just like that. Less than 25 words. "I want to join you."
Wow.
And it was, I really think it had a lot to do with the fact that I had this uh, courageous woman next to me.
Yeah.
And why why not? It was like Bruce said to me, if you feel it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. And I got a woman setting an example of what you do when it is the right thing to do, walking right next to me. Why not? And remember, I had this other crazy thing. I was young. And when you're young, you just don't think you're going to die. I think the third thing was Joe Carter and the police really were serious about being there.
Yeah.
That also made me feel a little calmer.
Yeah.
And the other crazy thing is that every time we did something like that, and when we went into the housing project, the radio stations and the papers and the TV folks were jumping all over themselves to walk in with us.
Right.
It
Right.
was, it's like, hey, everything's gonna be all right. Come on, I got Bruce, I got Joe Carter, I got
Yeah.
the police, I got the TVs running. I'm gonna do this.
Right.
Turn around and say I'm scared in a situation where I'm surrounded by protection.
Right.
Come on,
Right.
it's not gonna happen.
Right. It was very, very important that we shared with the residents that we know that when we leave, you're not going to have this level of police protection. You only got it
Yes,
because we're here, you know? So you've got to know who some of these law enforcement officials are, because I remember there were times up around the church that automobiles, taxi cabs would drive down certain streets, deliver packages or pick up packages, and then drive out. So they were couriers. The taxi cab drivers were couriers for people wanting the drugs. And I remember that I talked to the police commissioner about it, and I told him that a group of us were going to go up to one of the streets that they're doing this on, and we were going to stop every taxi cab and say that they can't do that. And he says, Bruce, you can't do that. You cannot tell the taxi cab drivers. I said, well, this is what we're gonna do. But we created the Boston police were like jumping through hoops because they did not want the brass did not want anything to happen to any of us on their watch, right? And so
that's right.
if you can transfer that to the residents once you leave, then
Right.
you've done your job. That was the job, is connecting the community to the same law enforcement people that were working with us, and that we wanted them treated the way that they treated us.
Right. And as I recall, we saw promotions being made. We saw people of color being brought into the uh, situation. We saw officers getting out of their patrol cars
Yeah.
and starting to walk and talk like we had to people. They were they began. I say to this day that we had an impact that today is called community policing.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were there for that. We were a part of that. We helped bring that about. And it is not something that is done readily nor easily. And it is in competition with a drive to militarize the police that makes the neighborhood the enemy.
Right. 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 And
the offset is what we helped create: community policing. Get out of your cars and talk to people.
yeah. Yeah.
Come on,
Right.
be there, be in the community. Don't drive through it.
Right. Don't drive by it. Yeah. Yeah. When I came to this church in 1993, I declared that 20, 10, what did we say, 10 blocks around the church. We said we wanted to have 10 blocks around the church be crime, drug, and violence free, that we were going to work these 10 blocks. And I began to say if every church owned their blocks, they could make a significant difference in holding this back. But not a whole lot of churches caught that vision. Not a whole lot of churches wanted to do it. And today, most of what we did in the 80s and 90s is now gone. If you were to ask me what police officer I talk to regularly, who walks the streets with me, what police officers do you know? I would have to tell you, I don't have any officers in the department that well, let's put it this way. There's only one in the department that I trust and his name is Larry Ellison, Detective Larry Ellison. He's the one that we all go to, but he's only a detective. He's not a superintendent. He cannot do what Joe Carter did. Joe Carter, being a superintendent, could command people to do this, and I want this report, and I want that. The guy that we're working with is a detective. He doesn't have clearance to get the things for us, but he's the only officer in the entire city of Boston, black officer, that we all go to, but they won't put him in a position of authority and power. Um, and it frustrates us because we really we have no one to go to, and he doesn't have anyone in his own department to go to. So eh, right now with the games that the politicians are playing, Boston is gearing up to go back to where it was in the 90s and potentially in the 80s because there's no activism on the street. And they just got rid of the street workers program because it wasn't working well. They weren't doing the job that they were supposed to do. So we're going
Really?
backwards. We're going backwards.
Huh. Uh, I, I, you know, I never really uh, got over my experience with you and Georgette. I've done a lot of thinking about this. I was very moved uh, when you and Craig talked about what's going on now with the shootings
Yeah.
and how the second, third generations, uh, uh, the neighborhoods have changed,
Yeah.
and that people people desperately need help that they're not getting.
Yep.
And I wonder whether something could be done about looking at some programs in other cities that appear to be working, such as Urban Peace, which was founded by Connie Rice
Okay.
in Los Angeles, and Pure Violence, which has grown out of Chicago,
Okay.
where they train folks in the neighborhood and to kind of do what we did,
Okay.
but with a focus on mental health and intervention. Um, remember Gang Peace?
Yes. And do you know Gang Peace was run by Rodney Daly? Do you remember Rodney Daly, the guy?
Yes.
Well, he just passed away two weeks ago. He no longer was doing Gang Peace. He had become a
Oh,
pastor. He was ministering in a church, but he died
wow.
2 weeks ago. And he did a good job with his Gang Peace. But those programs don't exist in our city anymore.
Well, this gang, when Gang Peace opened their storefront on Blue Hill Avenue,
Yep.
almost directly across from Roxbury Multi-Service Center,
Yep.
I I remember us looking at each other and saying, "Oh my God, they're going where we cannot go."
Right.
They are ex-gang members
Right.
who are determined to bring peace to this neighborhood. And they risked their lives, and some of them lost their lives
Yeah.
doing it. They knew what we didn't know, and we worked with them because we the you know it the world keeps changing,
Yeah.
and that their appearance on the scene was a sign that the next chapter had begun.
Yep. Yep.
And I see a new chapter now, and that potentially is envisaged by Cure Violence and Urban Peace, and possibly could be brought to Boston if we could, find a way to do it. Uh, Bill Bratton, who succeeded Mickey Roach,
Yeah.
is very tight with Connie Rice in LA.
Okay.
And you know, I think to myself, well, come on, isn't there some way we can make some connections to have some, you know, why doesn't Boston have something like that?
But you know, there are a couple responses to that. Boston
Okay.
used to be the city that other cities around the country and all over the world would come to Boston and study our models, study what we were doing. Boston doesn't want to acknowledge, because money was coming to Boston in the 80s and 90s, poured into Boston, into Massachusetts, because of how innovative our city was. But Boston doesn't want to admit that we're in trouble. And one of the recommendations I made to Marty Walsh, Mayor Marty Walsh, was that you needed to hire. I said you need to hire an urban sociologist, an urban planner, who had no ties to the city at all, would come in and study this city, and write a report, write a proposal. You know, do the like you just said, do the research around the country. What's working? What do you think could work in Boston? And bring that back to us, and then have some of us, along with city officials, evaluate it to see if it would work. And you also needed a plan, not a plan. The way Boston was planning was like, let's plan for the summer, and then after the summer, let's plan for the winter. I said no. When the city is planning for gentrification or planning for anything, they plan 10 to 15 and 20 years down the pike. They say, this is where we're at. This is where we want to be in 5 years. This is where we want to be in 10 years. And all the planning is looked through the prism of being able to have this thing work for the next 30 or 40 years. When the way they're doing it now, they're only planning for they're only planning for the summer, which tells me then they didn't accept the idea of having an urban planner come in to do it. They're turning to the neighborhoods and saying to the people in the neighborhoods, why don't you guys come up with a plan? Unfortunately, the neighborhoods are being filled with gentrified people who don't even have a clue of what's going on the streets. So
Correct.
Boston is not in a good place right now to admit that it's in trouble, to admit that it doesn't really know what to do. And if you've watched the news in Boston, whenever somebody is shot, it's a parade of elected officials coming out talking about the same thing. The residents have got to tell us what's going on. We've got to stop the violence. But Boston does not have a plan. And I'm shocked that the city that led the country doesn't have a plan and will not admit it.
Yeah.
Talk to me while the dog is barking.
I tell you, well, I've always been a guy who thinks the glass is half full and that something can be done. I'm a damn fool that way, even though I'm 82 now. I wonder whether there's some way of speaking to somebody and getting it done. I don't know. I mean, the last 10 or so years of my activism from 2004 to 2015 was in Middlesex County.
Okay.
And it's a whole different scene. And I teamed up with other activists to address substance abuse prevention in Middlesex County, which is more a focus on the suffering than it is on getting people arrested.
Okay.
about the suffering.
Right.
And we did manage to get some things done. Um, Peter Katujan, Middlesex Sheriff, uh, took an idea that we'd been pushing at everybody for about 4 or 5, 6 years, and has gotten the money to start 1 or 2 facilities called restoration centers,
Okay.
where there's no wrong door, where people whom the police find in trouble, especially with drugs, instead of being jailed, instead of driving to the jail, drive to the restoration center. And they're met by a staff of folks who help them deal with the issues they've got.
Okay.
Uh, Now that's Middlesex County. It's overwhelmingly white. It's you know, a whole different situation.
Yeah.
But I bel I I know that the focus has to be on the folks who are suffering. Has to be on the suffering. And I there are other I don't know. I like I said, I heard Bratton and Rice talking about urban peace, and then I read about cure violence, and I thought, I hope when I talk to Bruce, he'll tell me something like that's going on in Boston, and I am heavily distraught that there isn't.
Well, let me share two things. One, an associate of mine who was working in the 80s and 90s in the street has put together a 9-page comprehensive plan to address the violence that has a long range fix, not just looking for at the summer. And so um, I'm going. I made a request of the mayor if I could meet with her so that I could present this plan to her to see if she would be open to it. Because uh, some of the I don't know if you've been watching the news, some of the clergy have been on in a very aggressive attack of the Mayor Wu, and saying that she is neglecting the black neighborhoods. I've never had anybody come out that strong against her, and she's really under attack right now. And so I'm
Hmm.
hoping that what we're proposing might be the step in the right direction. And I'm presenting it. It's not my plan. I read it. I made some comments about it. But if the mayor would adopt something like this or parts of it and use it and not be afraid to say, I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution, but people are giving me things and I'm evaluating them rather than rather than rather than clamming up and saying nothing, really just defending your administration. We're not going to get anywhere. And
Hmm.
I haven't had clergy attack the mayor of the city of Boston like that in many, many years. So
Uh,
if we could see this thing open, then we can point to programs that you just talked about and say,
mhm.
there are two things that also might work in Boston. Let's go take a look at it. But you first have to acknowledge that you have a problem. And then you have to, and politicians don't want to do that. And then secondly, you have to acknowledge that you don't have the answers, but you're willing to work with people to find those answers. That's the kind of political leadership that we need. I don't know what to do, but I will work with the community. We'll work together to figure this out rather than simply
Mhm.
saying things are not as bad as they used to be. The numbers of homicides are going down. They're not going up. They're not trending up. Uh, that kind of thing doesn't make the people who are losing their children and family members to the violence. I mean, that 15-year-old child that was shot in Mattapan, shot 6 times point blank, and and they said that this 15-year-old was an innocent person, has no ties to any of the gangs, lives in Norwood, but was visiting his grandmother in Mattapan when it happened. And you know that the grandmother died a few weeks ago, and
Oh dear.
you know, and there are all kinds of speculations as to what happened to her. But can you imagine being the grandfather or grandmother of your grandkids, and they come and visit you and they die? How do you live with that? How do you live with that?
I don't know.
So,
I wonder, Bruce, too, there's a gentleman who might be key to this, uh, Botticelli. He was Barack Obama's drug czar
okay, okay,
from Boston, and he came back to Boston, and he's now at the Boston Medical Center.
okay,
Uh, his he was given $3 million by a couple philanthropist couple about 1 or 2 years ago to address the drug problem
okay.
in Boston. It would appear to me that he should be at the table. He should be talked to. If you could get him on your side, you'd have a
Yeah,
potential
yeah,
fulcrum.
send me his name, and I'll
I
see if I can get um
if I think the name is Botticelli.
Bonicelli.
And if I'm wrong, I'll let you know. He was in the federal government uh, uh, under Obama's administration,
Okay, okay,
and he's now at the Boston Medical Center.
okay. So we have 6 minutes to go. So could you talk to the audience about when Drop a Dime was all over, and I went back to the church and did continue my work in the church and at Shabu skating rink, and I continue doing what I was doing. Uh, what happened to you? What did you end up doing?
Well, one day Sandy said to me, "Alan, you spend an awful lot of time, and so have I, on Drop a Dime.
Uh,
And I think it's time you and I start thinking about what to do to retire."
uh, okay,
And it hit me right between the eyes. And
yeah,
I said, you're right. I'm spending half my time on Drop a Dime.
yeah,
So then, the police and everybody was all excited. They wanted to, take Georgette into the government and absorb the tip line and all that. And it was like, okay, we're walking.
yeah.
I retired in 2004, and I immediately knew there were three things I wanted to do
Yeah,
instead of work. I wanted to modify an old car, which we used to call sleepers.
yeah, yeah.
I wanted to go back to dancing,
Okay,
and I wanted to go into community service again.
okay,
Three things. New 5 minutes. Took me 5 minutes. So I walked into the Melrose police station. They asked them about a tip line, and they said, yeah, we kind of have a tip line, but it doesn't. And I introduced them to some ideas, and they ended up doing business with Tip 411. I then took that Tip 411 line and helped promote it. Got high school kids to walk the streets with cards and put them in businesses, and the tips started coming in.
okay.
And I talked to the mayor at the time, and he said, you know, if you want to give some time, uh, you ought to join this substance abuse prevention group. They've got some money and they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So I met Jen Kelly, who's now with in Charlestown with the MGH clinic there, and Penny Fanoli, who is now heading up the health department in Medford.
Okay.
And we formed a coalition of Wakefield, Reading, Stoneham, Melrose, and began to work on substance abuse prevention. And I tripped over a program in San Antonio, Texas, just by chance, called the Restoration Center.
Okay.
And talked to the founder, Max Baer, and figured out, you know, how he managed to do it. And we wrote a paper which we presented to the Pioneer Institute and pushed on the governor, and you know, sent to everyone we could think of, and talked it up for 5-6 years. And Peter Katujian, Middlesex sheriff, picked that up and has begun some restoration centers. And by that time, I was really I spent a lot of time in the street. Uh, uh, and one night I walked out of a MORE meeting, Marianne Frangoulis's operation, with 30 people that were users, people in recovery, families of people who'd overdosed, and trying to figure out, you know, how to get a project going in Malden. And I got out there in the dark and opened my car door, and I said to myself, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't do it anymore. I got to walk away. I'm starting to have PTSD and
Yeah.
kind of, you know, and I'm 74 years old. What, you know, and the next thing I knew, I was diagnosed with a heart problem to boot. And I thought, you know, God's talking to me.
Yeah.
Alan, step back.
Yeah.
Really, I think someone spoke to me that needed to tell me to take a break.
Right.
So that's what I did. And then I thought a lot about you, and here I am again. I just, as I wrote to you, you know, when you get in the street to the point where the street is in you,
Yeah.
and you just can't. I want to do something to help.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go out into the street to do it.
Yeah.
But it's what I and Sandy and you and Georgette and Craig did is, for me, the most meaningful thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
With my life.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you know, I now have your email address. I have your phone number. I can track you down, and I can, when I'm sending things out about where we're at with some of these things, I can let you know. And when we do these broadcasts, they're aired all over the city and all over the country. So there might be some additional things that we can talk about on the air for 30 minutes or so. Because the more you talk about it and engage about it, the more you're fleshing out some of the things that need to be done. And it might be interesting to get a call into Craig, myself, Robert Woodson, who used to be a part of it, and
Yes.
right, and have the four of us talk a little bit about where we're at now, and what do we see happening in our cities and in the country, and you know,
Yes.
we could create our own group to work through some of this stuff. But I have a broadcast that comes on every Tuesday from 9 to 10. It's called The Three Young Men. One of the guys is in Newark, New Jersey. We do it on Zoom and we send it on all the networks. The other guy's in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a white guy from Chattanooga, black guy from New Jersey, and me. And we're all old. We're all old. And people love to hear it because we're reflecting on what we've learned in life. And my wife says she likes the program. Different people are tuning in and listening. Again, we call ourselves three young men, but we're all seniors. And we meet once a week. It's like having a group. We meet once a week and we forget that we're talking through microphones and people are listening to us. We tell the truth about what's going on and people listen. So it might be interesting to see with you, Craig, myself, and Bobby doing one of these together and talk about where are we now, kind of thing.
Okay.
What do we see happening? And at my age, I've had multiple heart attacks, and so I have found that the microphone is a better way for me to communicate my thoughts and getting them out there than actually being out there. I don't have the stamina to do that anymore. But I found a way to do it, and so let's look at that the next time.
Yeah,
I'll talk to Craig and I'll talk to Bobby and see if they would be willing to get on a Zoom, and there'll be the four of us, and we can do this again.
I'm willing.
Okay, Alan, this has been good strolling down memory lane. You've opened up some thinking, some things in my mind to help me process the book I'm writing too. I'm trying to write about Drop a Dime and other things that I've done. And so let's keep this going. Let's keep it going. So I'll talk to the other guys.
Sign me up.
Back to you. All right. Well, thank you, sir. I'm going to get ready to take my nap and then get up and get some more work done. God bless you, my friend.
Okay.
Okay.